Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard, and thank all of you for coming out on what is otherwise a very beautiful day outside. If you haven't been outside for some time, do make sure to get outside. It's great to be home again. My wife and I have lived in many different places, and there isn't a place that we hold dearer than Chicago. And in that respect, I need to thank Richard, of course, for that generous introduction, but also Richard and Mary Gray, and Richard and Barbara Franke, great friends whom I know are instrumental to the establishment and development of the Humanities Festival. I don't know how many of you were here this morning when Salman Rushdie spoke, but he said the first thing he said when he came out was that you couldn't get a crowd of that size, which was about 5 times or 10 times the size of this crowd, in New York on an occasion like this, because it just doesn't happen. It happens even less often in Los Angeles, in great part because the competition of what's happening outside, meaning sunshine and cool breezes, is severe, and one has to meet that competition head on. Here, coupled by the fall-winter weather, but by your incredible curiosity about the world, allows us to advance the cause of the humanities, and I'm grateful to all of you for allowing me to be a small part of your celebrations of the humanities. Now, I want to talk about antiquities and to whom they might belong, or to what they might belong, because it's more of a what than a whom most often. And I wanted to begin by by framing it in a couple of sort of memories of mine. One memory was when I went to the first museum to which I'd ever gone. I don't come from a family that went to museums. I, in fact, come from a military family, an Air Force family, and we tended to be stationed in places distant from centers of habitation, closer to missile silos than to museums. So I didn't get to a museum until I was 19 years old, and when I was 19 years old, I went to the Louvre. And I went to the Louvre because I was in Paris, and because that's sort of what one does, or did, at that time. It wasn't because I had a drawn curiosity about what was in the museum, because, of course, I had not been to one ever before, so I didn't know what was in the museum, but it was a place that one went to. And in those days, when I was 19, that was in the late 60s, no one else seemed to be in the museum. I mean, things have changed dramatically now from then, but nevertheless, there was hardly anybody in the museum. And I was allowed to wander through the museum on my own and allow discrete works of art, to capture my attention and to allure me to them and to provoke my curiosity about them. And I found myself, in places and before things of which I had no understanding, no frame of reference, no way to make sense of them in any kind of learned way, but rather just drawn to what they were, and in that being drawn to what they were, having my curiosity provoked about them, allowing me to be curious about them forever since. So there was that sense that there was an identity that happened, an exchange of identity that happened, where I found that thing in a small way belonging to my frame of reference all of a sudden, that my life would be forever changed by that fact. And I found myself looking at these things in some kind of wonder about them, these objects that were unknown to me from places and times of which I'd never heard. And I realized that some had a profound moment, at least, when you're 19, everything seems to be profound. But in this case, I think it may have had some profundity to it, which is that I found myself looking and caring about these things as the people who might have originally made them and looked upon them for the first time thousands of years ago might have cared about those things. And between those original people and myself, thousands of years had transpired, and millions of people had looked at that thing and cared about that thing too, wondered about that thing, and wanted to protect that thing, and in fact did protect it as it passed over the course of centuries and millennia, even in some cases, to me. And I thought, I'm sort of at one with them. I'm sort of that family of people who care about these things. And all of a sudden I realized that this wasn't an abstract experience. This was a real experience in which that thing and I joined together across time and space to introduce me to a world of people to which I would not otherwise never have had such an introduction. So that was one thing that sort of framed my thinking. The second thing that framed my thinking was when I became a museum director and had some responsibility for things with, of course, all the colleagues with whom I worked. It happened to be in the mid to late 90s, and it happened to be in the context of genocide. genocide in Rwanda and Srebrenica and the fighting in the former Yugoslavia, where there was ethnic cleansing going on. And the way by which one executed ethnic cleansing was not only to kill people who were different than oneself, but to kill the things that represented in one's mind those people to whom they had some kind of relationship, to remove from the built universe those things that came from other places that represented some kind of threat to the homogeneity of the universe, the monotheism of one's universe that one wanted. And I associated those two things together. That is, I associated different people with different things, and I watched the ethnic cleansing take the form of cultural cleansing at the same time. And that was alarming to me. That was the first time I'd sort of come across something like that. A third story was when I was in a conversation with the head of the European Union at the time, previous head Manuel Barroso, and he was telling me about an experience he'd had. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal, you may remember, before he went to the European Union, and he had gone to a performance of Shakespeare, translated into Portuguese, inspired by a Roman myth, which in itself was inspired by a Greek antecedent. And he thought just how extraordinary it was that lineage of art and ideas had come in and through the Portuguese language to him, and that he had access to that lineage by virtue of being a learned, curious man, but by virtue of that Portuguese translation of things. And the fluidity of culture was what impressed him and impressed me. At the same time, I was in the midst of all kinds of discussion and debate about to whom culture belongs. Does it belong to the world? Does it belong to a nation state? And there was a real difference between things, physical things, and their ownership, and literature or music. We don't feel the same, or at least it's not said that we feel the same about the work of Beethoven as we feel about the work of ancient artisans whose identity we don't know. But because they are things, they have physical presence, there's got to be some ownership of them in ways there isn't the same kind of ownership over a musical score or literary text, at least those that are beyond the reach of the copyright law. And so I wondered about that too, why it is that we put so much constraint on the ownership and access to, therefore, these physical things, when we don't do the same over literature that's translated, music that is performed, and we don't allow ourselves that same kind of identity. For a moment, Barroso was identifying with Shakespeare, who was identifying with Roman antecedents, who were identifying with Greek antecedents, and Barroso had, and we all have, access to that same lineage of identity. But when it comes to antiquity, claims are made against them that prevent us that same kind of identification. And so I've been wondering about this for quite some time. I want to place all of that in the context of what's happening now in the Middle East and Syria and Iraq at the hands of ISIS. Because we're seeing, again, as we saw in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, an extraordinary example of ethnic cleansing coincident with cultural cleansing, and taking the advantage of the cultural cleansing to deny the ethnic cleansing, or to promote the same vision of ethnic cleansing. And I want to suggest that that we might be making a mistake in the manner in which we go about the preservation of these things, and then I want to ask why it is that we even are concerned about their preservation. The mistake I think we might be making, and we've been making since 1970, is that we've been outsourcing the protection of these things, the conservation of these things. And by these things, I mean both portable objects that can be removed from a location and the built heritage that's there that can't be moved, temples, churches, whatever it might be, architecture, sculptures of such substantial presence and form and weight and so forth. But we're outsourcing the protection of that to the nation state, within whose boundaries, within whose borders these things happen to have been found and where they happen to be. And we don't have ourselves a claim on them unless we are citizens of or subjects to the ruling leadership of that particular nation state. And I wonder if that's the best way to go about it, if that doesn't keep those things in harm's way rather than elevate them to positions of where they can be better preserved. And I want to talk about, in that sense, about sovereignty, and sovereignty as defined by the nation state, and whether there isn't some way to intervene across borders to protect them. So I want to come from that sequence of stories of identity to this larger question of preservation. When it comes to the question of to whom or to what culture belongs, again, we're talking about physical things, because it's a different set of answers when we're talking about literature or music. And I want to divide up to whom it belongs in two kind of categories. On the one is when it's property, and when we talk about cultural heritage, we often also say cultural property. So it's about ownership, it's about belonging, grasping onto something that one can control access to and protect. And why is that of interest to some nation states, where there's a sense that that property is theirs, it falls within the physical, the borders of the state, but that it also attracts tourists, and with tourists come dollars, and that's what we're seeing so anxiously working out today in Egypt, where because of violence, not just at Sharm el-Sheikh on the Red Sea, but also in Cairo and Luxor, where tourists seem to be at risk. So tourism is not going to Egypt, and there's a decline, therefore, in their economy as a result. So there's a material value to these things that is being jealously guarded by the nation states that have the responsibility of protecting them. And then there's a sense of exterior or external politics. That is, that it's to the advantage of these nation states with significant remains of antiquity in them, within their borders, to promote themselves as having a long legacy of distinction that puts them at the table with other nations that may be richer in other kinds of resources than in antiquities, to claim a kind of equality for their position in the world. So on the one side, there's a very clear material strain of interest, of property, of economy, and of external politics. On the other side, there's a less tangible sense of association with these things that has to do with ideology of identity, of national identity. A national identity which, of course, is claimed by the ruling authorities over the nation state. It doesn't come naturally. There is this sense, romantic notion, and by romantic I do mean early 19th century notion of actual identification with, as somehow sharing the same roots in a literal sense, and as well as a metaphoric sense with these things, that there is some identity that it can only be theirs, that they're born together somehow to this identity, that it isn't some identity that they've assumed simply because these things have been found within the borders of the nation state, but because they themselves were born in that nation state. They share a kind of identity with these things that no one else shares with them, that no one else has access to them, because no one else was born within those borders except those who were born within those borders, those who are citizens or subjects of the ruling authorities of that. And then there's the internal politics of that, where the ruling authorities want themselves to be identified with the long lineage of greatness of those that those antiquities represent. The sense that one could be called, if one was the ruler of Egypt, the modern pharaoh. That there could be an identity with that ruling authority. Or Saddam Hussein, who looked back upon the ancient remains within Iraq and saw them as actually being continuous in ways that he always pointed out Egypt was not continuous. And therefore Iraq was more important than Egypt. And he was more important than the ruling authorities of Egypt himself, because he was in the long lineage of the longest continuous culture, manifestation of culture in the world, from his point of view. So this sense that ruling authorities can make these claims that benefit them when they claim descent from these antiquities. So we get a sense of why nation-states make claims on them. On the one hand, physical reasons of doing so, of protecting them, deriving economic benefit from them, of being at the seat of international tables because of them. And on the other side, because of an ideological position, that one is actually related to them, that one somehow shares the same family history as these things, that when they are destroyed, one is oneself hurt by that, and that I'm making this claim as the leader of a nation state, because then I can claim myself in my leadership position as in direct descent from the earliest leaders in that realm, that region. And I could claim a kind of importance, and I can make you claim as my subjects that confirmation of my importance as one goes forward. So in 1970, the UNESCO, which is the soft power arm of the United Nations, wrote and developed a convention which was meant to discourage the illicit trade and transfer of ownership of antiquities from one point to another by closing the borders around nation states, such that those antiquities that were found within those nation states could not be transferred across those borders, could not be taken illegally or illicitly. And that meant effectively almost none could, because of course almost all are owned, literally owned as property of the state. And so what they did was effectively enforce borders on the transfer of culture. And these borders, of course, which are modern borders, they're not ancient borders, they're not the borders that applied in the time in which those antiquities were made and developed, but rather they were imposed upon them by modern eras. I mean, the nation-state borders are as artificial as nations themselves are artificial. Nations aren't natural things. They're things made by people. They're made by people, by governments. They're enforced by laws and by the military for enforcement of those laws, military including police enforcement of those laws. So they are artificial as entities and artificial as borders, but we outsourced our protection of antiquities to those artificial entities, and we allowed those artificial entities to promote a sense of ideological identification with them. That was 1970. That was the end point of a very long development from, let's say, 100 years before, 150 years before, when there was an arrangement made between foreign excavating teams who would come to the Middle East, essentially in the ancient Near East area, and in exchange for their expertise working alongside local excavators, they would share in the finds of those excavations and remove a part of them by agreement with the local authorities to the excavating institutions of those foreign excavating teams. That's how the Oriental Institute's collection at the University of Chicago was built. That's how the collection at the British Museum was built, the collection of antiquities. That's how the collection at the Louvre and the Musée Guimet, the Metropolitan Museum, to less an extent at the Art Institute, because that was, I think, I've always wondered about it, but I think that must have been assumed that was the province of the Field Museum for Anthropology and of archaeology, the province of the University of Chicago. But it was an agreement. It was an exchange. It was called partage. It was called sharing of finds. And that allowed two things to happen simultaneously. It allowed those things to be the basis of collections abroad, in Chicago, in New York, in Paris, in London, and at home, in Cairo, in Baghdad, in Damascus, wherever else in the region they were, that allowed them. So simultaneously, one built local collections and one built foreign collections. And in the building of foreign collections, one provided others in the world access to them than those who had access to these collections locally in Baghdad or Damascus or Kabul or Cairo, wherever it might be. That was called partage. That worked for quite a long time. And then at the end of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, as those areas were divided up into nation states, and nations had to be formed, then less and less was that possible, until now it's almost no longer possible. That's had the consequence of, in an effort to build national identity, as I explained earlier, that's had the consequence of keeping those things in harm's way, unfortunately. I mean, I don't know how many of you are insurance adjusters, but if you are insurance adjusters, you'll know very well that the important thing to do is to disperse the risk to goods rather than concentrate the risk to goods. And the consequence of concentrating the risk, these antiquities within the borders of a nation state, is to concentrate the risk to them. Because calamity can happen anywhere. We know it can happen in New York, it can happen in London, it can happen because of terrorist attack, it can happen because of natural disaster, but it's not likely to happen everywhere simultaneously. But the more that one concentrates the risk, the more one puts those things at risk, and that has been a consequence, perhaps an unintended consequence, of the laws and conventions that have followed upon the First World War and the Ottoman Empire. So one has to think about the benefits of that. The other thing that it's done, it's inhibited the global interest in our access to these things, because one can go to New York, one can go to Chicago, one can go to London, one can go to Paris, and one can get access to these things, and not just alone can one, but with others who are coming from other parts of the world. And that promotes a kind of experience, as I had when I was this 19-year-old who went to the Louvre, which is, it can provoke a kind of curiosity about strangeness and difference, and that curiosity can lead to a kind of tolerance. And tolerance not only of difference in the world distant from oneself, but typically and increasingly, and as you know in Chicago, and as we know with this horrific immigration that's happening today, is that more and more the difference that we experience is between ourselves and our neighbors. And now the more that we can be tolerant of that difference, the more that we can harmonize our communities. And that means that's based on understanding of difference, which is access to things different than oneself. That's been compromised by this concentration of antiquities or of cultures within the confines of the modern nation state. Now comes ISIS. When one has outsourced the protection of these cultural items, these artifacts, of antiquities or others, but typically of antiquities, to the nation state, on the principle, well-intentioned perhaps, that that's the best way to protect them because one is investing the responsibility of protection in the modern nation state. What happens when that authority, that nation that has the authority over the nation state, can't control that nation state? What happens when the borders of that nation state don't cohere to the authority of the nation state itself? So we have in Syria almost about 50%, or sometimes even say 60% of the land there under the control of ISIS. And ISIS, of course, doesn't value things made by others different than itself, or things that represent points of view different than their own, and rather it is threatened by such things. And so to remove those things is to the good of ISIS. And they frankly have control and authority over that because the Assad regime has no control or authority over 50% or 40% of its or 60% even of its property, of the property of the nation state itself. So it falls to ISIS, just as it fell to the Taliban in Bamia in Afghanistan. They ruled over that region. They had authority over that region by dint of their power to do whatever they wished to do with the cultural property that was and heritage in that region. And they destroyed it. And we watched it happen. So what concerns me is that because of past practices, that is, ways of dealing with the protection of cultural heritage through this convention of 1970, UNESCO, as example, outsourcing it to the sovereignty of nation states, we are simply reacting to situations. We're setting ourselves to be forever reactive in this situation, so that we're not looking to prevent things from happening. We're only called upon to wring our hands and rent our frustrations when they happen. We don't protect them in advance of their happening, but we respond to their having happened in really only one way, and that is to issue resolutions in the United Nations which condemns the activity. And that's in part because that's the basis of the United Nations. The United Nations is the entity, of course, where the international community addresses complications like this. And the United Nations is based on a foundation that respects the sovereignty of the nation state. And the UNESCO then, in its 1970 convention that reinforced that with regard to the protection of cultural heritage, was simply doing as one would do within the United Nations. So I'm very concerned right now about the question of sovereignty. And in my world, when one talks about that, that is in the world of cultural institutions and educational institutions, one finds this rather awkward and unhappy alliance between the far left and the far right, politically speaking. In the far right, as you'll know, and there's an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, signed by the leading far right political leaders who don't have authority other than within their parties, but because they're not ruling the nations, but nevertheless of France and of Italy and of Spain and of Germany, who claim that there is a threat to the sovereignty of the nation state by the European Union, and that the identity of each of those separate states was being lost in the process of the diminution of authority of the sovereignty of the nation state. And they wanted to claim back authority over their borders, and authority, therefore, over the identity they see to derive from that national identity. That's the same as on the far left. On the far left, there's unholy alliance between the entity, the region, and the people living in the region and the things found in the region to reinforce the kind of identity that is thought to be indelible and natural. It's calling for a greater, again, concentration of things in separately governed and mapped out and bordered places. So the whole question of sovereignty, which would otherwise pit left and right against each other, seems to join left and right with each other. And I'm concerned about that. Now, there are times when we overcome the limits of sovereignty through treaties. And sometimes those are military treaties. Russia, as you know, has military bases in Syria, and Syria, therefore, has negotiated the loss of some of its sovereignty in a certain region, the way we have military bases elsewhere in the world, and that sovereignty of that nation state has been, some aspect of it has been compromised by a treaty signed with us. So there are opportunities, there are instances in which the sovereignty is given up willfully through treaties, military treaties, but through treaties that are really interesting ones, like the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, where both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states come together to try to negotiate the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also the decommissioning of nuclear weapons. And in coming and joining into such a treaty, one is willingly giving up some authority that one otherwise had, because one thinks now it's in its best interest to give it up. So I'm wondering, are there not situations where one couldn't give up the authority of, one has over the cultural heritage in a region, because it's in one's self-interest to do so, because one wants those things to be protected, and one could convince others to join you in their protection by helping you control access to those things so that those things can be preserved. Now, there are two ways to preserve things, and they're different on whether the things one's seeking to preserve are portable cultural heritage objects can be moved across borders, and those things, as I said earlier, that can't be moved. They're built heritage, that are architectural remains, temples, churches, whatever it might be, old forts that could be, or whether they simply are so big, like sculptures, that they can't be moved across. And so in the case of those that can be moved across, the UN's response has been to encourage people to close the borders even further, so as not to allow them to cross those borders on the presumption that if they don't cross those borders, they won't be able to participate in a market that will encourage the further illicit excavation of those things. So one's cutting them off, not at the source, but at the market end of this exchange. The consequence of that has been to, as I said earlier, to keep these things within harm's way often, because they're not only not allowed to be removed from the nation state, but they are forced to be returned to the nation state if found outside the borders of the nation state. So that's the response the United Nations has been able to marshal with regard to portable objects, and it has argued argued in support of this initiative that the selling of these portable objects has gone to support some of the activities of ISIS. So they're aiding this military entity. It's hard to call it a band of terrorists. It's much too big and complicated to call it a band of terrorists. But they are saying that the sale of these things are of such a size and such an extent that they're actually supporting ISIS to a considerable level. Now, we don't know that. We know it's very clear that there is illicit activity. We have no evidence that illicit activity is coming to museums of reputation in the United States or in Europe. In fact, we don't see it at all. So because we're not involved in the black market, it's not likely that we will see such things. But if there is a black market, and there seems to be a black market, the assumption is that it's staying locally. So there's not much that we can do, therefore, to prevent that from happening. So it's not stopping the controlling of the portable heritage, keeping it within the borders of the nation state, returning it to the borders of the nation state when found. That's not stopping these things from being illicitly traded across borders. What we don't know is the extent to which that's really meaningful in the funding of ISIS. There's been to my knowledge, and I've read quite a lot, there's been no evidence of the extent of the value of this activity, while there is evidence of this activity for sure, and there is damage caused to the archaeological record for sure. So that's not a good thing. But there is a response to it, however compromised the response is, to close the borders and to try to protect those borders and to keep things from crossing out from the nation state. But that doesn't address the built heritage, the stuff that remains within there, in Palmyra, in which we've seen the destruction of the former temple of Bel, and we've seen the destruction of aspects of Greco-Roman architecture, and we've seen the beheading of an archaeologist, and we've seen four other humans who have been tied to the columns of these ancient remains, only to have them and those columns blown up. So we've had very dramatic incidents of destruction of the cultural heritage that's built. We've had the dramatic destruction of the very large, call them portable objects, but they're so large they can't be easily moved from the museums, and you saw that in Iraq and Mosul, where ISIS came in and destroyed so much of it. So how does one protect those things that can't be easily moved? The things that can be easily moved, one can create safe harbor zones for them, where they can be moved out of Iraq and Syria and kept until they can be returned in some safe place, like refugees are kept by the United Nations in refugee camps until they can be removed. So there is a process, although the United Nations hasn't embraced that process, and no other nation state has embraced that process. The United States Congress has proposed a bill, that is, the House has. The Senate hasn't picked up that bill, and of course then it hasn't passed to the President for signature. So there is no safe harbor yet, but there's at least, one can imagine such a thing. But there is not any interest, it seems, to actually go into Syria, into Iraq, to protect those built heritage sites, was putting them at just continuous risk. Now, there's a means by which the United Nations can do that, of course, and that's the blue helmets. Those are the peacekeeping forces, much maligned in recent, but you'll remember in 1988 they got the Nobel Prize. The whole peacekeeping troop entity of the United Nations got the Nobel Prize for peace. So there's a mechanism for doing that, but again, it's much maligned and much disputed. The United States gives more than 50% of the funding for it in billions of dollars for the blue helmets, but contributes only 80 military and police individuals to it. Most of the actual military and police entities in the peacekeeping forces come from developing nations. So we sort of buy our way into protecting it with money, not with personnel. In any case, we're not going to be able to protect those things if we don't have actually means of protecting them on site, in place. So they will be destroyed. I guess ultimately the question is, who cares? Why do we care about these things? I think we care about them for a number of reasons. One is the fact that they're disappearing on our watch. They've survived for thousands of years through all kinds of tumults, in place and having been moved, having been returned, exposed again. and we're watching them being destroyed, and we're doing nothing to stop them, or doing very little to stop them, their destruction. These are things that represent the work of genius and of importance by people who long preceded us. And by our turning our back on them, it's to suggest that only we are important and they aren't important. We're not accepting our responsibility to usher the past into the future. Sometimes people will say, why would you do that when there are so many people dying and so many people put at risk, so many people who are abandoning their homes in Syria and Iraq and finding their way through hardship as much as they can to Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, and Greece to Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe to Northern Europe, and even to North America. And that we shouldn't be so concerned with cultural heritage while that problem is still going on. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think we have a choice between those two. I think we can do both attend to the needs of refugees as we can do attend to the needs of at-risk artifacts of antiquity. I think as well that there's a sense of responsibility that we have for the environment, that we're not turning our back on our care and responsibility to the environment by turning our attention to the care of cultural heritage. So I hope we'll find a way to do this, but I'm afraid I'm not entirely pessimistic for, again, a number of reasons. One is it's reactive, what we do. It's not proactive. It's based on outsourcing it to the sovereignty of the nation state, and that's concentrating the risk of such things, and it's putting them in harm's way when they do return to areas of instability where the nation state is not only incapable of protecting these things, but is in fact, as in the case apparently in Syria, a failed nation state. And the third is we're treating these things differently than we treat literature and music, where we celebrate the seamless transmission of music and literature through languages across borders, and we value that. And we value that because, and we see it here, we've seen it in Chicago here, and I was at the Art Institute with a project that we had with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble. We celebrate the transmission of culture. We recognize that's in history, that's how culture it develops. It develops out of access to profound and wonderful and strange different things through trade, through migration, through missionary work, through imperialism, all kinds of things that have brought people into contact with each other, the legacy of which is this shared shared cultural heritage we call the world's cultural heritage. So I think we've got to find a way to address the problem. We've got to find a way to address the problem that is forward-looking, that recognizes that perhaps the sovereignty of borders is not sufficient, and outsourcing that responsibility to those nation states is not sufficient to protect them. And it's going to be a very difficult thing, but we are seeing such a dramatic example of the destruction and coincidence between ethnic cleansing and cultural cleansing that something must be done to stop it. And stopping it means that I should stop talking about it and have opportunity to talk with you about it. That is, questions and answers to questions you might have, such as I can provide them. Finally, but last before I say it, we heard it this morning with Salman Rushdie, a perfect example of someone who lives in this country, born in Mumbai, writes from a wealth of cultural associations in his work in a language that is not the language of the origin of those cultural associations, and transmits the beauty of those cultural associations through his writing. We've got to find a way that we can do that not only in literature and in music, but in the built heritage of our worldly predecessors. So thank you for listening to this, but I would love to have a conversation with you. Sorry to take up too much time.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. We'll come around with microphone.
2 or 3 here.
It's important that you speak into the microphone, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's fascinating to hear your perspective on this, something that we see in the paper and don't know exactly how to assimilate it, and you've helped to point us in several directions. I had a question, though, about your use of the phrase outsourcing. That implies that there's an alternative that we've missed or that you would recommend that we consider. And I know the opposite would be insourcing, but what would you see as as a preferred alternative given the lessons we've learned over the last decade or so? And also, I was wondering if you have thoughts about this applying to, say, rare animals, where the tusks of certain animals will lead to their slaughter, and yet we leave the decision about preserving them to the nation state in which those animals completely unintentionally end up living.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that your last point is the right point. I mean, that we share something here between the things we make and the things that live coincident with ourselves, and we have responsibility. I mean, to usher into the future the goodness of the earth, the goodness of the built and cultural heritage that we've inherited. Now, how to do that? All I can think of, and I'm not very sophisticated in this regard, and I don't know enough about the complexity of what I'm going to suggest, but there are ways of doing it, and I mentioned it before with the blue helmets of the United Nations, that there are, we do invite from time to time, not we, the United States, but others invite others to come into their nations through treaties and agreements and understandings to protect valuable assets. Those assets could be oil wells, they could be hospitals, they could be educational institutions, they could be natural resources other than oil, whatever it might be. But there's a way to bring them in, to say that we can't by ourselves do it. We need your help in doing it. And maybe the United Nations should spend as much time encouraging those at-risk nations to allow for and to invite in other entities through the blue helmet peacekeeping forces that exist already, by which there is a means of imposing them upon and encouraging their intervention. That seems to be the only way one can do it. It means there's a risk involved. There's a risk involved in protecting any kind of asset and protecting the resources of any nation state that's at risk. So I think that might, as far as I can tell, the only other thing one can do is for those things that are portable and that have been removed, to keep them in safe harbor until they can be returned. And the third is to encourage partage, this return of the sharing of finds, so that they can be shared with the world for the two reasons. One, for their protection, but also for their being able to inspire a sense of wonder about difference in the world and ultimate time. Because it's going to be about transnational education. The only thing that's going to, I guess the fourth thing, sorry, I'm making this up as I go along, but the fourth thing is, an effort to help restore the civil society of that region. It's got to be people have to find hope in that region. They've got to find hope in the prospects of finding a job in that region. They've got to be able to, in order to stay there, not to abandon it in its entirety, they've got to be given some reason to hope for a future in that region. So we've got to work soft power, and that's both in cultural and economy, as well as, I think, in hard power. I don't see a way around it. And it puts a lot at risk, I understand. But as far as I can tell, otherwise we're just going to watch it happen, and we're going to be sorry that it happened on our watch. But there were a couple of other hands.
We have a question back here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm curious I'm in the very back row.
Oh, sorry, okay.
I'm curious about your thoughts about art that is in existing institutions and claims from the nation state of origin that the art should be returned to those countries.
Yes, thank you. These things get be heated quite quickly because the language used is itself freighted with ideology, and the language is often repatriation. And for those of you who are as old as I am will know the repatriation is a term that comes from the claims on the return of prisoners of war, so that it's got a sense that these things are being held against their will outside the country, so-called of origin. That is, they weren't originally from that country because that country itself didn't exist, but at least from that region of the world, which is now bordered, within which it's in the borders of the country. So there's a heated ideological claim. Sometimes there's a legal claim, and when there's a legal claim, these things ought to be returned, it seems to me, because of course one doesn't want to hold something one can't hold legally, so these things get returned. And why do we have them illegally in the first place? It may be in part because little was known about them when they were acquired, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 70 years ago, 100 years ago in some cases, and one learns now more about them since. And with the found of new evidence, it's the same with any kind of legal situation. With new evidence, you can then feel compelled to return these things to be in keeping, to meet the terms of the legal regime. So indeed, I think those things should be returned. But sometimes things are called back because they are said to belong in some ideological sense to that nation state, that they derive from a common origin, as I said earlier in my presentation. That I don't believe to be the case. And there's got to be some reason why it's of benefit to both sides for their return. And sometimes there might be a willingness to give it up, might invite a kind of participation that would have been impossible without doing so. And one negotiates that relationship in the process of conversation about the return. But simply because a nation calls for their return, and some nations have done it with the most dramatic effects, when they've said that these things deserve to come back because they're abandoned without their souls. Their souls are in the land from which they were removed. And this kind of rhetoric that we apply to things, as I said, but we don't apply to literature, we don't apply to music, we don't apply to ideas, we apply to tangible things that have market value, I think, is partly of this thing. And so there are these exaggerated claims. I don't think those exaggerated claims ought to be naturally responded to positively. Legal claims have to be. If there's evidence something's been removed against the laws of the region, they have to be returned to the laws of that particular nation state. The question, though, is if there were a safe harbor, they might be returned to that safe harbor before they could be returned into harm's way. But that would have to be in negotiation with the authorities of that nation state. The problem with it in Syria is with whom does one negotiate these returns, if these returns were to come up, or who does negotiate their being held in safe harbor, because there's nobody home in Syria right now, or there's too many people at home in Syria right now for that negotiation. I hope that's clear enough. Yes, there's two here, and there was another one over here somewhere.
I really appreciate your remarks about the difference between portable items of culture and in situa items of culture. And I totally embrace the idea that for our world to understand that we have this shared culture, it's important for people to be able to have the encounter you had at 19 and to be able to interpolate that to the big world. Now, in reinstituting portage, wonderful idea. However, having traveled to Egypt and seen that what ISIS is doing to the in situa cultural heritage is not very different from what other cultures have done historically. Sure. For instance, the defacing of the Egyptian gods over there. So, I think to myself, your average man will never go, like lucky me, to Egypt to see that. He will perhaps go to the Oriental Institute, and he will react emotionally to a portable object, and will, in his mind, be able to interpolate it to that bigger world. However, is not the destruction that happens to those in situ things a much more powerful statement to him than sending in blue helmets to put a perimeter around a building and put people at risk, and the destruction may be more powerful than the retention, is my thought. Now, what do you think about that?
I would hate to agree, I must say, but I understand your point. Certainly, the willingness to sacrifice something in order to arouse the concern of the world is something I would not want to do, but I can understand that there might be some benefit to that. You could derive benefit from that, but it's a benefit that I wouldn't want to encourage or suggest. But I understand that might be the case. But I want to get back to a couple of things. One thing is, you're right. We're not just looking at these ferocious, crazy people identified collectively as ISIS. when thinking about these kinds of iconoclastic activities, because that's been true throughout history, and that's been true even as recently as in Cambodia, but also as in France with the revolution and the defacing of the sculptures of kings, the French kings that came before. So it's not just a religious thing, it's a cultural thing, it's an historical thing, it's a power thing, it's a complicated thing, but these things have power. I mean, the sort of good news about this, everyone's looking for good news, is the reason these things are being attacked is because they've got power. If they didn't have power, they wouldn't be of any threat to ISIS or any threat to the French revolutionaries or any threat to the leaders of Cambodia, whatever it might be. So the reasons that they have, that they're being attacked is they have power. So we should protect them for that reason. But it's confirmation that we've got a respect for these things, and we are, I think, not meeting our obligations to preserve them in part for that reason. But I think that sometimes I've also heard the argument is, why worry about them? They can be reproduced, just like the Bamyan Buddhas. They can come back and reproduce them, so let's do them again. I think it's letting us off the hook, because they can never be reproduced. They're never the same thing. They're a simulacrum of that thing. They're a fake of that thing. And if the fake is as good as the original, then we've got no reasons for conversation. I mean, it just doesn't. We're not on the same page. So I don't think that we should just simply. We at the Getty, working with the Oriental Institute and something called the American Schools of Oriental Research, and the State Department, are working with a program we've got called Arches, which is a computer program that's geospatial-based, open source program, which allows people to document from satellite images the current conditions anywhere in the world, whether it's Los Angeles or Palmyra. So we can document what's going on. The assumption is that's going to help us later to know what no longer exists. But that's a sad thing to do. That's just documenting destruction. It's not preventing destruction. I still think we need to find a way to prevent destruction.
I have time for one more question.
Well, there's one over here too. So we have two more. We've ignored over here. In fact, we've never even looked over here. I'm sorry. Here's another. So maybe three more. Very, very quick.
Do we need a concept of a shared human civilization in order to prevent?
Do we need a what?
A concept of a shared human civilization and origin in order to prevent these kind of extreme ideas from taking shape?
I think we have it. I mean, the Bible is that. It's just that somehow the non-tangible thing, ideas, can be shared, but tangible things cannot. They exist only in one place at one time, and for various reasons we jealously keep them from keeping ourselves from sharing them. So I think on the one hand we have examples of it, we just have to find a way to share the tangible things along with the intangible things.
Great, we do have time for one more. Sorry,
I tried.
I was wondering if you have any experience in the entities that you suggest that have control of these objects that are being destroyed or dispersed, and that any movements that they are making, recognizing the risks that they have to those objects, and them seeking the help that you're suggesting either from the Blue Hats or someone else.
We don't. So at the Getty, we have a lot of experience in the conservation of built heritage, whether it's a Mughal-era medieval fort in Rajasthan in India, or whether it's King Tut's tomb right now in Luxor in Egypt, or whether it's the Mogao caves in the western part of China. But those places are not, to date, at risk for destruction. Those things that are at risk in Syria and Iraq, we have a program by which we train conservators to deal with mosaics, which are the legacy of ancient Rome in the Mediterranean basin, and that included Syria. And there was a time 4 years ago when we were able to get conservators out of Syria to Rome for training to then go back into Syria to be prepared to take care of these things. But it's impossible right now to get into Syria, so we don't have access to that right now. Do you want to talk afterwards? If they want to kick us out here, quick, shout it out, quick. Okay, very quickly about what we call the Parthenon marbles. But it's a complicated thing, that Lord Elgin removed them, and some portion of them. More remain on the Parthenon than are off the Parthenon, but nevertheless, some were removed, and they're now in the British Museum, and they've been in the British Museum for 200 and 200 years, let's say. And there's a claim for their return, and it's the claim that can't be adjudicated by law because there's no evidence that they were illegally removed. There's a firman, something called a firman. There was no Greece at the time. It was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and they were removed according to this firman. There's a debate about what removal means. Does removal mean taken away, or does removal taken down for reasons of study? In any case, it's not going to happen because of some legal agreement. It's going to happen because of some diplomatic agreement, if it should happen and will happen at all. But it's a big problem. And there, the Parthenon was, after the establishment of the independent Greek nation, it was cleansed of cultural accretions subsequent to its Athenian origins. So there was a mosque on the Parthenon, that was removed. There was a Byzantine church on the Parthenon, that was removed. So it's not an easy, tidy answer to a question. It's not as simple as it sounds. It's a very complicated set of conditions.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for questions.
Thank you very much.